Immediately claiming central territory, 1e4 boldly stakes a claim for influence and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop. The Sicilian defense immediately fights for the center and creates an unbalanced pawn structure, setting the stage for dynamic play and counterattack. Opening up the bishop and developing a piece, white prepares for central pawn breaks while increasing pressure on black's formation. Developing the knight here solidifies central control and prepares for further pawn advances, creating a dynamic and balanced position. Opening the center invites a sharp, dynamic struggle for central control. Opening the center now often leads to rapid piece development and tactical skirmishes. Knight boldly strides into the center, opening lines and challenging black's central presence immediately. Challenging the knight's central dominance, black immediately seeks active piece play and prepares for a potential kingside pawn push. Developing another knight here asserts control over crucial central squares and prepares for potential pawn thrusts. Challenging the knight and gaining central space, this aggressive advance immediately complicates the position. Launching a knight to b5 immediately disrupts black's pawn chain and puts pressure on the d6 square, aiming to exploit any weaknesses that arise from black's recently advanced e-pawn. Solidifying the center and preparing to contest the d5 square, d6 anchors the pawn chain while opening lines for the dark-squared bishop. This move aims to improve piece coordination and prevent white's knight from dominating further. Directly challenging the knight on f6, this bishop sortie immediately tightens the screws, aiming to disrupt black's central pawn structure and potentially exploit weaknesses around the king if the knight is forced to move. It creates immediate tactical possibilities and forces black to consider their defensive setup rather than focusing solely on development. Challenging the knight's perch on b5, this pawn thrust forces white to make a decision about its advanced piece, potentially creating a dynamic tension where lines of attack could open. Retreating the knight to an open square concedes central control and allows black excellent piece development opportunities, particularly for their queen's bishop and potentially king's Indian attack formations, while this knight now finds itself awkwardly placed on the edge of the board. Black immediately confronts the encroaching knight, seeking to gain queenside space and hinder white's knight's continued occupation of the advanced b5 square, although this aggressive pawn push does create a potential weakness on the c6 square. Asserting central dominance with the knight's daring outpost, white immediately challenges black's pawn structure and eyes the d6 weakness, forcing a decision about piece placement and potentially opening lines for a kingside attack. Developing the bishop to support the kingside pawn structure and prepare for castling is a sensible choice, addressing the immediate threat of the knight on d5. A tactical reset is initiated, forcing a choice that alters black's pawn structure and opens lines. The bishop's sacrifice offers a clear exchange, simplifying the position while potentially creating weaknesses around black's monarch. Consider how this concession of material aims to disrupt black's pawn chain and gain a tempo for development. Reclaiming that bishop solidifies black's pawn structure and liberates the g8 knight, preparing it to join the fray by heading towards c7 or e7, aiming to support the queenside development and contest the open files. This recapture also opens up the diagonal for the queen, potentially creating new attacking avenues or defensive resources. Solidifying the knight's outpost, white aims to secure that central foothold and potentially use the c3 pawn as a launching pad for future queenside expansion, while also offering a defensive anchor for the knight should it be challenged later. Castling tucks the king away safely behind a pawn shield, a fundamental defensive maneuver that prepares the rook for potential action on the kingside. Shifting the knight to c2 strategically prepares a later advance of the c-pawn, aiming to solidify white's central structure and potentially create attacking opportunities on the queenside by opening the c-file. Securing the rook on the b-file offers a powerful offensive posture, preparing to challenge the open file should white's knight retreat or be displaced, while also providing a defensive anchor against potential kingside advances and contributing to central space control. Initiating a flank pawn thrust to gain queenside territory and potentially trap black's rook opens up fascinating avenues, though it concurrently weakens white's queenside pawn structure and creates a potential target on c3. Slinging the knight to e7 initiates a crucial repositioning, aiming to defend the d6 pawn from potential ndb5 pressure and prepare for a potential c4 pawn push, subtly expanding black's central influence. Seeking to establish central control and prepare a kingside pawn storm, the knight relocates to a more active square, eyeing potential breakthroughs while reinforcing the d4 square and keeping an eye on black's queenside buildup. The bishop now occupies a more active diagonal, eyeing the queenside and potentially disrupting white's pawn structure should the opportunity arise. Initiating this exchange on the knight fundamentally alters the pawn structure's dynamic, offering a clearer path for white's central pawns to advance, while simultaneously forcing black's king into a more exposed position by removing a key defender. Recapturing the bishop immediately clarifies black's pawn structure on the kingside and frees the queen, which had been somewhat awkwardly placed, now aiming directly at the center. This move also subtly prepares for potential future pawn pushes like f5, while the now developed knight on g8 can find a more active square. Initiating a dynamic pawn advance, this maneuver aims to displace black's knight and potentially dominate the central squares. The queen now retreats, seeking safety and eyeing the queenside pawns, but this repositioning creates a slight lull, allowing white to consolidate their kingside space and perhaps prepare a central thrust with their advanced knight. Unleashing an immediate flank assault on the queenside, this pawn thrust aims to fracture black's pawn structure and gain valuable territory, potentially opening lines for white's rooks and queen. Unlocking the queenside with this bishop maneuver redirects attacking energy, seeking to exploit the potential weaknesses that white's pawn structure might soon present. Solidifying the kingside structure, g3 aims to create a robust pawn shield and prepare for potential kingside operations, while also offering the bishop a retreat square should it come under fire again. Unlocking the c-file becomes the immediate priority, aiming to destabilize white's queen's side and create avenues for counterplay. A peculiar retreat, this rook abandons the vital open file, seemingly sacrificing control for what exactly? Perhaps white hopes to prepare a future b5 push, or maybe it's a defensive maneuver to avoid some unseen threat on the third rank, but it feels passive, allowing black's pieces to breathe and potentially consolidate their central grip. The king's protection seems undisturbed for now, but this rook's current position appears strategically adrift. A fascinating decision to simplify. By exchanging the bishop for the knight, black aims to neutralize white's active piece and gain some breathing room, but it also cedes control of the dark squares around its king. This exchange might unlock lines for white's rooks later on, particularly on the c-file, so black must be vigilant in defending that crucial diagonal. It's a trade that opens up possibilities for both sides, and the ensuing pawn structure will dictate much of the middle game's character. Liberating the e-file for your rook presents a compelling opportunity to challenge black's queenside pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances down the open column. Unleashing the pawn's power, black injects dynamism into the center, aiming to disrupt white's tightly knit pawn structure and pry open lines for active piece play. Challenging the central pawn push, the bishop now eyes the diagonal towards the black king, creating latent pressure and disrupting black's potential kingside maneuvers. The bishop now repositions, seeking a more active diagonal and potentially supporting a future pawn push, while simultaneously preparing to redeploy from its exposed position on g5. Finally, the king seeks sanctuary behind a pawn wall, a prudent decision to shore up the monarch's safety amidst the growing complications on the board. Capturing the pawn, black seizes a temporary material advantage. But critically, this exchange exposes the light squares around white's king and opens the c-file for white's rook, potentially creating dangerous attacking avenues. Unleashing a forceful pawn push across the 7th rank, white immediately challenges black's weakened queenside structure, aiming to shatter its defensive cohesion and exploit any lingering vulnerabilities. Securing the passed pawn on the queenside opens up promising avenues for counterplay. Asserting control over the open queenside file with the rook, provides a direct threat to black's pawn structure. Opening up the long diagonal for the queen adds pressure on the queen side, aiming to exploit the slightly awkward placement of white's rook on a5, potentially forcing concessions or creating tactical opportunities should white's pieces become disorganized. Aimed at activating the queen and probing potential weaknesses on black's queen side, this maneuver seeks to disrupt black's solid pawn structure and create opportunities for white's pieces to penetrate. By repositioning the queen from the c-file, white is now looking to exploit the open diagonals and files that may arise as the position unfolds, potentially targeting the vulnerable b-pawn or creating threats against black's king's defenses. Reshaping the defensive perimeter, black intends to reinforce the kingside by bringing the rook into a more active, centralizing role, aiming to contest the open files and potentially create counterplay against white's potentially exposed king. The rook suddenly appears on the 6th rank, a bold assertion of presence that immediately questions black's cramped queenside coordination and threatens to exploit weaknesses along the entire flank. This maneuver aims to solidify black's pawn structure and prepare for a potential queenside pawn advance, while also creating an escape square for the king on h7 if needed. Reinforcing the c-file advance, this repositioning of the rook not only aims to pressure black's doubled pawns, but also creates a strategic blockade, limiting the mobility of the black queen and preparing for a potential pawn push into black's territory, all while offering a slight pawn sacrifice for initiative. Suddenly, the bishop embarks on an ambitious journey to d2, seeking a more active post and eyeing white's potentially exposed king on the queen side. Shifting the queen to b2 cleverly aims to improve its central influence and potentially eye the d4 pawn, while also preparing for a future queenside advance or defense depending on black's intentions with their bishop on d2. Unleashing a pawn-pawn storm to shatter the enemy's defensive structure, this pawn thrust injects immediate dynamism, threatening to pry open lines and create new avenues for attack. Shattering the established defensive structure with a bold pawn thrust, white aggressively aims to puncture black's king's safety and disrupt the coordination of their pieces. Unleashing a pawn storm's fury now might be premature, as black consolidates their queenside presence with this repositioning, preparing to contest the crucial c-file and potentially pressure white's weakened pawn structure. Unleashing a surprise assault by sacrificing the rook on d6 aims to pry open black's defenses, but it simultaneously exposes white's king and leaves crucial squares undefended. The immediate follow-up will dictate whether this bold gambit leads to a crushing advantage or a positional unraveling for white. The pawn push on h5 immediately stakes a claim on the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's defensive setup and potentially open lines for black's attacking pieces. This energetic advance signals an intent to seize the initiative, creating uncomfortable queenside pressure while simultaneously threatening to expand further. It's a bold commitment to opening up the board, potentially at the cost of king's safety if white can effectively counterattack. Initiating contact on the open file aims to exploit black's somewhat compromised pawn structure and centralize white's rooks for a potential endgame advantage, though it also risks overextending if black can generate counterplay on the kingside. Reclaiming the open c-file becomes paramount now. Bringing the rook to a more active post directly contests white's control, setting the stage for potential skirmishes along that critical highway. Unleashing the rook to the d-file aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially open lines for further attack, forcing a reaction from the opponent's pieces. Unleashing the rook from its protective semi-open file, black injects immediate dynamism into the position by aiming to disrupt white's king's safety and seize control of the d-file. This forward-looking repositioning cleverly exploits the potential for counterplay, transforming a previously passive piece into an active threat and forcing white to confront immediate tactical questions on the queen side. Activating the rook on the 3rd rank, this move aims to disrupt black's centralized pawn structure and potentially exploit weaknesses around the king, though it also leaves the d-file momentarily less defended. A desperate gambit to disrupt white's monolithic pawn structure, sacrificing the bishop for the potential of creating chaos around the king and opening lines. Discarding the immediate material advantage, This exchange is a calculated gamble to disrupt black's formidable pawn structure and potentially trap the bishop. The sudden capture of the bishop on b2 profoundly alters the material balance, presenting a clear advantage in pieces for black, though this advantage comes at the cost of a somewhat isolated king and a potentially exposed pawn structure on the queen side. White will now attempt to exploit the open lines and potential weaknesses around the black monarch. Pivoting the rook from the d-file to the e-file now shores up that weak pawn on e4, simultaneously preparing to challenge black's active bishop on b2 and prevent any further penetration by black's queen. The exchange of the bishop for the knight on e5 fundamentally alters the structural landscape, simplifying the position and initiating a distinct endgame phase where piece activity and pawn structure become paramount, rather than the earlier complex maneuvering. The material is now level, but the pawns on the kingside offer white a clear advantage in terms of pawn structure and potential for kingside play as black's king is exposed. A desperate attempt to reignite some attacking life, though the doubled pawns on the queenside and exposed king cast a long shadow over this initiative. Attempting to solidify the bishop's influence on the queenside, this placement aims to discourage further pawn advances and potentially create a safe haven for white's king if an exchange materializes, though it also leaves the piece somewhat exposed and reliant on support from the f-pawn. Facing immediate pressure on the 7th rank, the rook strategically repositions to the open 8th file, aiming to contest control and create counterplay against white's exposed monarch. Unleashing the passed pawn creates immediate immense pressure. Its promotion is now the game's defining threat, forcing a desperate defensive posture. Reclaiming the central pawn opens up the f-file for your rooks, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside structure and pressure white's king, which is now exposed after the pawn sacrifice. The doubled pawns on the d-file are finally resolved, and the ensuing pawn structure now presents a clear path for the white rooks to become active. Seizing the open d-file presents a dynamic opportunity to disrupt white's centralized king and potential pawn advances. The rook's reroute aims to consolidate the newly opened d-file and support the pawn's advance towards the promotion square. Reclaiming the file is paramount now, as the rook's active placement disrupts white's control and opens avenues for counterplay. Reactivating the bishop to its original diagonal, and now potentially eyeing the kingside pawn weaknesses, creates dynamic attacking potential. The rook slides over, eyeing the now open file, creating a potential battery with the queen that could put serious pressure on white's vulnerable king. Securing the monarch's safety is paramount as the game shifts towards its endgame. Repositioning the king to the g2 square offers a more sheltered haven behind the pawns. The rook's relocation to the 5th rank immediately challenges white's well-fortified pawn structure, aiming to exploit the exposed white king and the potential for creating a passed pawn on the kingside.